The train whistle pierced the morning air as Barbara Coleman stepped onto the platform at Millbrook Station, Nevada, her heart racing with anticipation. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry Samuel Harrison, a rancher she knew only through letters. But when she arrived at the small frontier town, black ribbons hung from every doorway, and the church bells tolled a mournful dirge. Samuel Harrison was dead. As she stood frozen in shock beside his coffin, a man approached her, identical to Samuel in every way except for the scar across his left eyebrow. "I'm Edward Harrison," he said quietly, "Samuel's twin brother, and I believe you were meant to marry me instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The locomotive's brakes shrieked against steel rails, jolting. Barbara Coleman forward in her seat as the train came to its final stop. Through the dust-streaked window, she could see the weathered wooden sign, Millbrook Station, Nevada Territory, 1882. Her gloved hands trembled as she gathered her burgundy, carpet bag, and the small leather satchel containing her most precious possessions. After 7 days of rattling across the American continent from Philadelphia, she had finally reached her destination. The conductor's voice boomed through the passenger car. "Millbrook! Last stop for Millbrook!" Barbara rose on unsteady legs, smoothing the wrinkles from her navy blue traveling dress. She had chosen the outfit carefully, wanting to make the best possible impression on the man who would become her husband. Samuel Harrison had written that he would meet her at the station, and she wanted him to see a refined, capable woman worthy of his proposal. The September air hit her face as she stepped down from the train, carrying the scent of sagebrush and something else, something that made her pause. Wood smoke, but not the cheerful kind from cooking fires. This smoke carried a heavier, more somber quality. Barbara looked around the small station platform, searching for a tall man with brown hair and kind eyes, as Samuel had described himself in his letters. Instead, she found herself staring at a town draped in black. Every visible doorway, every window, every porch post was adorned with dark ribbons that fluttered like ravens' wings in the desert breeze. The few people moving about the dusty main street wore somber clothing and spoke in hushed tones. Even the children seemed subdued, their usual frontier exuberance replaced by an unnatural quiet. "Miss Coleman?" A gravelly voice startled her from her observations. She turned to find an elderly man with a silver beard and wearing a black armband. "Ah, you'd be the lady coming to marry Samuel Harrison?" Barbara's stomach clenched with a sudden, inexplicable dread. "Yes, I am Barbara Coleman. Is Mr. Harrison delayed? I was expecting him to meet me here." The old man's weathered face creased with sympathy. "Name's Deputy Marshal Jake Stevens, miss. I'm afraid I have some terrible news." He removed his hat, revealing thin, grey hair. "Samuel Harrison passed away 3 days ago. Mining accident up at the Silver Bell claim. Cave-in took him and 2 other men." The world seemed to tilt beneath Barbara's feet. The platform, the train, the black-draped buildings all swayed as if she were still in motion. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, though even as she spoke, she knew there wasn't. The evidence was all around her. The mourning ribbons, the hushed voices, the deputy's solemn expression. "No mistake, miss. I'm really sorry you had to come all this way for such sad news." Deputy Stevens gestured toward the town's main street. "The funeral's this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Been delayed waiting for his brother to arrive from Sacramento." Barbara stood motionless, her mind struggling to process this information. Samuel Harrison, the man who had answered her advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, who had written her 12 carefully composed letters over the past 4 months, who had sent her train fare and promised her a new life in the Nevada Territory, was dead. She had sold her small inheritance, left her position as a governess, and severed ties with the only life she had ever known. Now she was stranded in a frontier town with less than $40 to her name and nowhere to go. "Miss, you look like—" "You might faint," Deputy Stevens said, taking her elbow gently. "Why don't you come sit down? There's a bench right here in the shade." Barbara allowed herself to be guided to a wooden bench beside the station building. The morning sun was already growing warm, but she felt cold all through. "I don't understand." She said more to herself than to the deputy. His last letter was so full of plans. He wrote about the house he was building, about the land he'd purchased for farming. He said he was looking forward to my arrival. Samuel was excited about getting married, that's certain, Deputy Stevens confirmed. "Talk about you to anyone who'd listen. Show us your photograph too. Said you were going to help him turn his mining money into a proper agricultural operation." He paused, studying her face. "Begging your pardon, miss, but what will you do now? Do you have a family back east you can return to?" The question hung in the air like the dust kicked up by the departed train. Barbara stared down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. "No," she said quietly. "No family, no position. I sold everything to make this journey." The full magnitude of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was utterly alone, in a place she had never seen, dependent on the kindness of strangers, in a town that was mourning the very man who was supposed to provide for her future. "Well," Deputy Stevens said after a moment, "Millbrook's not the kind of place that abandons folks in need. The widow Patterson runs a boarding house just down the street, clean rooms, fair prices, and there's always work for a capable woman in a town like this. If you're of a mind to stay, stay." The word echoed in Barbara's thoughts. She had come west, seeking a new beginning, expecting to find it through marriage to Samuel Harrison. That dream was gone, buried with him in whatever grave awaited at today's funeral. But perhaps there were other new beginnings to be found, other ways to build a life on the frontier. Before she could respond to the deputy's suggestion, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming hard down the main street, his horse lathered with sweat and dust. As he drew closer, Barbara could see he was a man of perhaps 30 years, tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He reined in his mount near the station and dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Deputy Stevens," the man called, striding toward them. "I came as soon as I got your telegram. How bad was it?" "Real bad, Edward," the deputy replied, rising from the bench. "Cave-in happened fast. Samuel and the others never had a chance." Barbara's breath caught as the man called Edward turned toward her. The resemblance was unmistakable. He had Samuel's height, Samuel's build, even Samuel's dark brown hair and strong jawline, but there were differences too. Where Samuel's photograph had shown a gentle, scholarly face, this man's features were harder, more weathered by sun and wind. A thin white scar ran from his left temple to his eyebrow, and his eyes, though the same warm brown as Samuel's, held a different quality, more guarded, more knowing. "This here's Miss Barbara Coleman," Deputy Stevens said by way of introduction. "She came to marry Samuel." Edward Harrison removed his hat, revealing hair that was slightly longer than his brother's had been in the photograph. "Miss Coleman," he said, his voice deeper than Samuel's had sounded in her imagination. "I'm Edward Harrison, Samuel's twin brother. I'm sorry for your loss, and for the circumstances that brought you here." Twin brother. Barbara had known Samuel had siblings, but he had never mentioned being a twin. Looking at Edward now, she could see the similarities that marked them as identical, the same height, the same basic bone structure, the same coloring. Yet they were also distinctly different men, shaped by different experiences and different choices. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Barbara managed to say, rising from the bench. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss as well. Your brother seemed like a good man from his letters." "He was," Edward agreed, his gaze studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Samuel always was the dreamer, the planner. He wrote to me about you, about his hopes for the future you'd build together. Barbara felt heat rise to her cheeks. It seemed strange to be discussed by these brothers, to have been a topic of their correspondence. He was very kind in his letters, she said, very optimistic about what we might accomplish together. Samuel was always optimistic, Edward said, and there was something in his tone, not bitterness exactly, but perhaps a weariness that his brother had never shared. Sometimes too optimistic for his own good. Deputy Stevens cleared his throat. Edward, the funeral's set for 2 o'clock. Preacher Morrison's waiting on you to make the final arrangements. And there's the matter of Samuel's affairs. The mining claim, the property he bought, his plans for the house. Edward nodded, replacing his hat. I'll handle all of that. He turned back to Barbara. Miss Coleman, I know this isn't the homecoming you expected. If you need anything, lodging, travel arrangements back east, anything at all, please let me know. Samuel would have wanted me to see that you're taken care of. The offer was kind, but something in his manner suggested it was duty rather than genuine concern that motivated it. Barbara lifted her chin, summoning the dignity that had seen her through her parents' deaths and her subsequent struggles. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, but I can manage my own affairs. I'm not a charity case. Edward's eyes sharpened slightly, as if her response had surprised him. I didn't mean to suggest you were. I only meant that Samuel had certain obligations, certain promises he'd made to you. With his death, those obligations fall to me. Your brother's promises died with him, Barbara said firmly. I expect nothing from you, Mr. Harrison. You owe me nothing. For a moment, they stared at each other across the dusty platform. Barbara was aware of the deputy watching their exchange with interest, of other townspeople beginning to gather as word spread of Edward Harrison's arrival. She was also aware of how completely her life had changed in the space of 10 minutes. The future she had imagined, planned for, traveled toward, had vanished like morning mist in the desert sun. Deputy, Edward said finally, not taking his eyes off Barbara, would you mind giving Miss Coleman directions to the boarding house? I need to see about the funeral arrangements. Of course, Deputy Stevens replied. Miss Coleman, if you'll gather your things, I'll escort you to Widow Patterson's place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Barbara collected her carpetbag and satchel, acutely aware that these few possessions represented everything she owned in the world. As she prepared to follow the deputy into town, Edward Harrison spoke again. Miss Coleman. She turned back to face him. The funeral is at 2 o'clock at the community church on Maple Street. You're welcome to attend if you feel it's appropriate. Barbara considered this. She had never met Samuel Harrison, had known him only through his letters. Did she have any right to mourn him publicly, to stand among his friends and neighbors as if she belonged there? Yet in a strange way, she felt she did have a right. She had given up everything to come to him, and had committed herself to sharing his life. His death had orphaned her just as surely as if they had been married for years. Thank you, she said. I believe I will attend. Edward nodded once, then strode away toward the town's main street, his spurs ringing against the wooden platform. Barbara watched him go, noting the confident way he moved, the respectful nods he received from the townspeople he passed. This was a man who commanded respect, who was known and valued in this community. Yet she sensed something lonely about him too, something solitary that even his obvious competence couldn't entirely mask. He's a good man, that Edward Harrison, Deputy Stevens said, apparently reading her thoughts. Different from Samuel, but good in his own way. Come on, miss, let's get you settled at Widow Patterson's. You'll want to rest before the funeral. As they walked down Millbrook's main street, Barbara took in her surroundings with new eyes. This was no longer a place she was visiting, a temporary stop on her way to a new life. This might actually become her home, at least for the foreseeable future. The town was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined with substantial buildings, a bank, a general store, a hotel, several saloons, and what appeared to be a newspaper office. Side streets branched off in both directions, revealing residential areas with modest but well-maintained houses, most surrounded by small gardens that spoke of community pride and permanence. The people they passed were friendly enough, tipping their hats to the deputy and offering polite nods to Barbara, though she could feel their curiosity. News traveled quickly in a small town, and she suspected that her story, the mail-order bride who arrived to find her intended husband dead, would be common knowledge by evening. Widow Patterson's boarding house proved to be a large two-story frame building painted white with green shutters. A wide porch ran across the front, furnished with rocking chairs and hanging baskets of flowers that added a welcoming touch despite the black ribbon draped over the front door. Deputy Stevens led her up the steps and knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 50 years old, with graying brown hair, pinned neatly back, and intelligent hazel eyes that took in Barbara's situation at a glance. "You must be Miss Coleman," she said without preamble. "I'm Harriet Patterson. I heard about your arrival and about poor Samuel. Come in, dear. You look like you could use a cup of coffee and a quiet place to sit." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Barbara's careful composure. She followed Mrs. Patterson into a neat parlour furnished with comfortable chairs and a settee, the walls decorated with botanical prints and samplers. The room spoke of a woman who took pride in her home and cared for her guests' comfort. "Deputy Stevens," Mrs. Patterson said, "thank you for bringing Miss Coleman by. I'll take good care of her." "I'm sure you will, Harriet," the deputy replied. "Miss Coleman, if you need anything, the sheriff's office is just 2 blocks down on Main Street. Don't hesitate to call on us." After he left, Mrs. Patterson settled Barbara in the parlour with coffee and fresh-baked biscuits. "Now then," she said, settling herself in the opposite chair, "tell me what you're thinking of doing. I know this must be a terrible shock." Barbara wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, grateful for its steadying heat. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "I sold everything I owned to make this trip. I have very little money and no family to return to. I suppose I'll need to find employment of some kind." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of work did you do back east?" "I was a governess for several years, and before that I helped my father with his bookkeeping business. I can read and write well. I'm competent with figures, and I have some knowledge of music and art. Those are valuable skills out here," Mrs. Patterson said. "We have families who would pay well for someone to tutor their children, and several of the local businesses could use help with their accounts. It wouldn't be the same as being married. To Samuel Harrison, of course, but it could be a good life. A good life." Barbara turned the phrase over in her mind. It wasn't the life she had planned, but perhaps it could be something worthwhile, nonetheless. She was 24 years old, healthy and educated. Surely she could find a way to support herself, even in this remote frontier town. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "I'd like to stay, at least for now. Could we discuss terms for boarding here while I look for employment?" "Of course, dear. My rates are reasonable, and I'm sure we can work something out." Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "I think you'll find Millbrook a welcoming place once you get settled. We take care of our own here." The phrase echoed what Deputy Stevens had said earlier, and Barbara found it comforting. Perhaps she could become one of their own, could find a place for herself in this community. It wouldn't be the place she had expected to find, but it might be good enough. As the morning wore on, Barbara rested in the small but comfortable room Mrs. Patterson had given her, trying to prepare herself emotionally for the afternoon's funeral. She would be attending as a stranger, yet also as someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by Samuel Harrison's death. It seemed important to pay her respects, to say goodbye to the man whose letters had brought her across a continent, even if she had never had the chance to meet him in life. Through her window, she could see the town continuing its preparations for the funeral. The community church's bell tower was visible several blocks away, and she could see people coming and going, making final arrangements. Somewhere among them was Edward Harrison, the twin brother whose existence she had never suspected, whose presence had already begun to complicate her understanding of her situation. Barbara changed into her one black dress, appropriate for mourning, and pinned her dark blonde hair back severely. In the small mirror above her washstand, she looked pale but composed. She would attend Samuel Harrison's funeral with dignity, she decided, and afterward she would begin the difficult task of building a new life from the ruins of her old plans. The afternoon sun was bright and hot as 2 o'clock approached, but Barbara walked to the community church with steady steps. Whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high. She had come west seeking a new beginning, and she was determined to find one, even if it looked nothing like what she had originally imagined. The community church of Millbrook had never seen a gathering quite like this one. Barbara stood at the back of the sanctuary, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale complexion, watching as the entire town seemed to file through the wooden doors. Miners still dusty from their shifts, shopkeepers in their Sunday best, families with children, who whispered questions about death that their parents struggled to answer. Samuel Harrison had clearly been more than just another resident. He had been woven into the fabric of this community. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with kind eyes and premature white hair, conducted the service with genuine warmth. He spoke of Samuel's vision for the future, his generous spirit, his excitement about the agricultural ventures he had planned to pursue. As Barbara listened, she began to understand the magnitude of what had been lost. Samuel hadn't just been planning a marriage. He had been planning to transform himself from a miner into a farmer, to use his modest fortune from the Silver Bell claim to create something lasting. Samuel Harrison believed in tomorrow, the Reverend said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. He believed that with hard work and faith a man could build something better than what he found. He believed in the power of partnership, of two people joining their dreams together to create something larger than either could achieve alone. Barbara felt tears sting her eyes. These words described the man she had come to know through his letters, optimistic, forward-thinking, eager to build a life of meaning. She had been prepared to be that partner, to help him transform his mining, profits into agricultural success. Now that partnership would never exist, those dreams would remain forever unfulfilled. She noticed Edward Harrison sitting in the front pew, his shoulders rigid beneath his black coat. Unlike the other mourners who wept openly or comforted one another, he sat alone and still, his grief private and contained. Even from the back of the church, she could see the tension in his posture, the careful control he maintained over his emotions. After the service, the congregation filed out slowly, many stopping to offer condolences to Edward. Barbara hung back, uncertain of her place in this ritual of community mourning. She was neither family nor longtime friend, yet Samuel's death had shattered her future just as surely as it had ended his life. As the crowd thinned, she found herself face to face with Edward Harrison once again. Up close, she could see the strain the day had taken on him. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, and the scar on his forehead seemed more pronounced in the afternoon light, filtering through the church windows. "Miss Coleman," he said, his voice hoarse from the emotional toll of the day, "thank you for coming. Samuel would have appreciated knowing you were here." "I felt I should pay my respects," Barbara replied carefully. The service was beautiful. It's clear your brother was deeply valued here. Edward nodded, glancing around the nearly empty church. Samuel had a gift for making people believe in possibilities. He could describe a future so vividly that you found yourself wanting to help him build it. He paused, studying her face. Is that what drew you to his proposal? His vision of what life could be? The question was more personal than Barbara had expected, but something in Edward's expression told her he genuinely wanted to understand. Partly, she admitted, but also the practical aspects. I needed a new beginning, and he offered one. It seemed like a fair exchange, my skills and companionship for security and purpose. A business arrangement, Edward said, and she couldn't tell if he approved or disapproved of such pragmatism. Initially, yes, though I hoped it might become more than that, given time. Barbara adjusted her gloves, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze. Your brother wrote that he believed affection could grow between two compatible people, even if it wasn't present from the start. That sounds like Samuel, Edward agreed. He was always optimistic about human nature. Something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely share his brother's faith in people's better angels. They were interrupted by the approach of a middle-aged woman with steel-grey hair and sharp blue eyes. She wore an expensive black dress that marked her as one of the town's more prosperous residents, and she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions heard and respected. "Edward," she said, extending a gloved hand to him, "please accept my deepest condolences. Samuel was a credit to this community." "Thank you, Mrs. Fairchild," Edward replied with careful politeness. "I appreciate you coming today." Mrs. Fairchild's gaze shifted to Barbara with undisguised curiosity. "And you must be the young woman who came to marry Samuel. How terribly tragic for you, my dear. What will you do now?" The blunt question made Barbara bristle, but she kept her voice level. "I'm still deciding, Mrs. Fairchild. I may remain in Millbrook for a time." "How resourceful of you," Mrs. Fairchild said, though her tone suggested she found the idea questionable. "Of course, a woman in your position has limited options. Perhaps you could find employment as a domestic. I might need a housekeeper myself." Barbara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the woman's condescending tone. "Thank you, but I have other skills besides housekeeping. I was a governess back east, and I'm quite capable with bookkeeping and correspondence." "How ambitious," Mrs. Fairchild replied with a thin smile. "Though I'm not sure there's much call for such services in a mining town. We tend to be more practical in our expectations here." Edward cleared his throat. "Mrs. Fairchild, if you'll excuse us, I need to speak with Miss Coleman about some of Samuel's affairs." "Of course," Mrs. Fairchild said, though she looked disappointed to have her interrogation cut short. "Miss Coleman, do consider my offer. Honest work is nothing to be ashamed of." After she left, Edward shook his head. "Don't mind Margaret Fairchild. She means well, but she has strong opinions about how the world should work, and apparently one of those opinions is that a woman in my circumstances should be grateful for any employment, no matter how beneath her qualifications," Barbara said. Tartly, Edward's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Actually, Margaret's opinions usually center on maintaining proper social hierarchies. A mail-order bride who aspires to anything beyond domestic service probably challenges her sense of order." Barbara studied his face, trying to determine if he shared Mrs. Fairchild's views. "And what do you think, Mr. Harrison? Do you believe a woman should accept her circumstances without question? Or do you think she has the right to pursue something better?" "I think," Edward said slowly, "that anyone willing to travel 2,000 miles to start over has already demonstrated considerable courage. What they do with that courage once they arrive is up to them." It wasn't quite the ringing endorsement of female independence that Barbara might have hoped for, but it wasn't dismissive either. She found herself revising her initial impression of Edward Harrison. He was more thoughtful than she had expected, more willing to consider perspectives that differed from his own. "You mentioned Samuel's affairs," she said, changing the subject. "Is there something specific you needed to discuss?" Edward glanced around the church, where a few people still lingered in quiet conversation. "Not here. Would you be willing to walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Barbara hesitated. Propriety suggested she shouldn't go anywhere alone with a man she barely knew, especially not on the day of his brother's funeral. But propriety was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her circumstances had changed too dramatically for her to cling to social conventions that might limit her options. "Very well," she agreed, "but I should tell Mrs. Patterson where I'm going." "Of course," Edward said. "I'll wait for you outside." Barbara found Mrs. Patterson among the group of women arranging food for the post-funeral gathering at the church hall. "I'm going to walk with Mr. Harrison for a bit," she said quietly. "He mentioned something about Samuel's affairs." Mrs. Patterson nodded, understanding. "That's probably wise, dear. There may be practical matters that concern you, given the circumstances." She lowered her voice. "Edward Harrison is a gentleman. You can trust him to behave honorably." Outside the church, Edward was waiting beside a black buggy hitched to a sturdy bay horse. "I thought we might drive out to Samuel's place," he explained, as he helped her up to the seat. "He'd been building a house there, getting ready for married life. I think you should see it." They drove in relative silence through the outskirts of Millbrook, past the last of the residential streets and into the scrubland beyond. The afternoon was warm, but not oppressive, with a dry breeze that carried the scent of sage and distant pine forests. Barbara found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like to call this harsh, beautiful country home. "Tell me about the mining accident," she said eventually. "If you don't mind discussing it." Edward's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "There's not much to tell. Samuel and 2 other men were working a new tunnel at the Silver Bell. The support timbers gave way without warning. It happens sometimes in mining. The risks are always there, no matter how careful you are." Was Samuel experienced in mining? In his letters he wrote as if he understood the business well. "He'd been at it for about 4 years, Edward replied. "Came out here after our parents died, looking for a way to make his fortune quickly. He was good at it, careful about safety, smart about where to dig. But mining is unpredictable. Even the most experienced miners can't anticipate every danger." Barbara sensed there was more to the story, something Edward wasn't saying. "You didn't approve of his mining career?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horse around a rocky outcropping. "Samuel was a dreamer," he said finally. "He saw mining as a means to an end, a way to accumulate enough capital to pursue his real interests. Agriculture, building a community, creating something lasting. I respected those goals, but I worried about the risks he was taking to achieve them. And what about you? What do you do for a living?" "I have a horse ranch about 20 miles north of here. Breed horses for the cavalry mostly, though I sell to ranchers and miners as well. It's steady work, not as potentially lucrative as mining, but more reliable." "More conservative," Barbara Sue. "Observed. More realistic," Edward corrected. "I learned early that big dreams can lead to big disappointments. Better to build something solid than to chase after possibilities that might never materialize." It was a fundamental difference in philosophy, Barbara realized. Samuel had been willing to take risks for the chance at something extraordinary. Edward preferred the security of modest, steady progress. She wondered which approach she found more appealing, given her current circumstances. They crested a small hill, and Edward pointed ahead to a partially constructed house in a valley. "There it is," he said, "Samuel's dream home." Barbara caught her breath as she took in the sight. The house was larger than she had expected, built from local stone and timber in a style that managed to be both practical and elegant. 2 stories, with a wide front porch and large windows that would provide abundant natural light. Only about half the structure was complete, but even in its unfinished state it was impressive. He designed it himself, Edward said as they drew closer. Spent months planning every detail. The kitchen was going to be large enough for serious cooking and canning. The parlor was positioned to catch the morning light. There was going to be a library and a music room for the piano he planned to order from San Francisco. Barbara climbed down from the buggy and walked slowly around the building, trying to imagine what it would have looked like when finished. The stonework was expertly done, the foundation solid and level. Samuel had clearly invested considerable money and effort in creating something worthy of the wife he planned to bring west. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Or it would have been." "He wanted to finish it before you arrived," Edward continued. "But the mining work kept interfering. He thought he could complete both projects simultaneously, extract enough ore to fund the construction while building the house in his spare time." "And now?" Barbara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Now, the silver bell. Claim belongs to Samuel's estate, which means it belongs to me, the house as well, all of his plans and dreams, everything he worked for." Edward's voice was carefully neutral, but Barbara could hear the weight of unwanted responsibility beneath his words. She walked to what would have been the front door, running her hand along the smooth stone of the doorframe. "What will you do with it?" "I don't know," Edward admitted. "I have my own ranch to run. I can't be in 2 places at once, and I don't know enough about mining to operate the silver bell safely. As for the house—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete. Barbara turned to face him, studying his expression in the slanted afternoon light. "You could sell everything, the claim, the property, the materials, take whatever profit there is, and return to your own life." "I could," Edward agreed. "That would be the practical thing to do. But you're not sure that's what you want to do." Edward was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the incomplete structure before them. Samuel believed this could be something special, not just a house, but the foundation for a different kind of life. He had plans for the land, crops that would thrive in this climate, livestock that could supplement the agricultural income. He saw it as a model for other miners who wanted to transition out of the dangerous work underground. "And you think those plans have merit?" "I think Samuel was smarter than I gave him credit for," Edward said quietly. "I spent so much time worrying about the risks he was taking that I didn't pay enough attention to the vision behind those risks. Now I'm wondering if I was wrong to be so cautious." Barbara walked back to where Edward stood beside the buggy. "May I ask you something, Mr. Harrison?" "Of course. Why did you bring me here?" "You could have simply told me that Samuel's affairs were being settled, that there was nothing that concerned me. Instead, you've shown me his dreams, his plans for the future." "Why?" Edward met her gaze directly, and for the first time since she had met him, his carefully controlled expression revealed something of the turmoil beneath. "Because I keep thinking about what the Reverend said today, about Samuel believing in partnership, in 2 people joining their dreams together to create something larger than either could achieve alone." Barbara's pulse quickened as she began to understand where this conversation was leading. "Mr. Harrison, I know it's presumptuous," Edward continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before he lost his nerve. "I know we're virtually strangers, and I know the circumstances are impossible. But you came here, prepared to help Samuel build something meaningful. You were willing to commit your life to pursuing his vision of the future." "I was prepared to marry Samuel," Barbara said carefully. "That's not the same thing as committing to a vision." "Isn't it?" Edward challenged. "You sold everything you owned, left everything familiar, traveled across a continent to help a man you'd never met, turn his mining profits into agricultural success. That takes more than just a willingness to marry. That takes faith in the possibility of transformation." Barbara stared at him, her mind racing to process what he seemed to be suggesting. "Are you asking me to consider some kind of business partnership to help you continue Samuel's work?" "I'm asking you to consider marrying me instead," Edward said bluntly. "Not for love. I'm not fool enough to pretend either of us could feel that so quickly, but for the same reasons you agreed to marry Samuel, because together we might be able to accomplish something neither of us could manage alone." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Barbara felt her world tilt once again, just as it had that morning when she learned of Samuel's death. This was the last thing she had expected, the last conversation she was prepared to have. "You're suggesting I marry you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man I met less than 12 hours ago?" "I'm suggesting you consider it," Edward corrected. "I know it sounds mad. I know it's not what you planned, but your original plan was to marry a stranger for practical reasons. Would marrying a different stranger be so different?" Barbara turned away from him, walking a few steps toward the unfinished house. Her mind was spinning with the implications of his proposal. It was practical, she had to admit. Marriage to Edward would solve her immediate problems. She would have security, purpose, a place in this community. And unlike the marriage she had planned with Samuel, this one would begin with honesty about its transactional nature, but it would also mean binding herself to a man she didn't know, trusting her future to someone whose character remained largely mysterious to her. Samuel had wooed her through letters, had given her time to form some impression of his personality and values. Edward was offering marriage based on a single day's acquaintance and the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. "Why?" she asked, without turning around. "Why would you want to marry me? You have your own ranch, your own life. You could find a bride who actually chose you, rather than someone who was forced into your path by tragedy." "Because I think you're exactly what Samuel said you were in his letters," Edward replied. "Intelligent, capable, brave enough to take risks for the chance at something better. Because I think his vision for this place was worth pursuing. And I think you could help me pursue it. And because—" He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. "Because I'm tired of being alone." The honesty in that last statement cut through Barbara's defenses more effectively than any romantic declaration could have. She turned back to face him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Edward Harrison was not his brother. He was harder, more guarded, more realistic about the world's dangers. But he was also lonely, carrying the weight of responsibilities and dreams that had never quite belonged to him. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is too important." A decision to make in the shadow of Samuel's grave. Edward nodded. "Of course, take whatever time you need, but while you're thinking, consider this. You came west looking for a new beginning. I'm offering you one. Not the same one you expected, but perhaps one that could be just as meaningful as—" They drove back toward Millbrook in the gathering dusk. Barbara found herself studying Edward's profile, trying to imagine what it would be like to share a life with this complicated, serious man. The proposal was practical, sensible even, but it was also terrifying in its implications. She had been prepared to marry Samuel Harrison because his letters had allowed her to construct an image of who he might be. With Edward, there were no letters, no carefully crafted courtship, no time to develop expectations or fantasies. There was only the raw reality of two people whose lives had been thrown together by circumstances beyond their control. The question was whether that reality could be transformed into something that resembled happiness, or whether it would remain forever a marriage of convenience, held together only by mutual need and the ghost of Samuel's dreams. As the lights of Millbrook appeared ahead of them, Barbara realized that Edward Harrison had given her exactly what she thought she wanted, a practical solution to her desperate circumstances. The irony was that now she found herself wanting something more than mere practicality. though what that something might be, she was not yet ready to say. Barbara spent the night staring at the ceiling of her boarding house room. Edward's proposal, echoing in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The practical part of her brain catalogued the advantages: security, purpose, a place in the community, and the chance to help complete Samuel's vision. The cautious part whispered warnings about binding herself to a virtual stranger whose temperament and character remained largely unknown. But there was a third voice, quieter than the others, that asked a question she wasn't quite ready to face. What did she actually want from life, beyond mere survival? Morning brought no clarity, only the necessity of making some decision about her immediate future. Barbara dressed carefully in her one remaining good dress, a deep green wool that complemented her fair complexion, and made her way downstairs to the boarding house dining room. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, but Barbara found she had little appetite. "You look like you didn't sleep much, dear," Mrs. Patterson observed, refilling Barbara's coffee cup. "Understandable, given everything you've been through. Big decisions shouldn't be rushed." Barbara glanced up, surprised. "How did you know I had decisions to make?" Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "This is a small town, Miss Coleman. Word travels fast, especially when it concerns eligible young women and the Harrison brothers. Edward's proposal wasn't exactly a secret by the time you returned to town yesterday evening." Heat flooded Barbara's cheeks. "People are talking about it already?" "People talk about everything here," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "It's not malicious, just human nature. A mail-order bride arriving to find her intended husband dead, then being courted by his twin brother the very same day. That's the kind of story that captures imaginations." "And what are they saying?" Barbara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Mixed opinions, as you'd expect. Some think it's romantic, two people finding each other in the midst of tragedy. Others think it's scandalous, too quick, too convenient. Most are simply curious to see what you'll decide." Mrs. Patterson sat down across from Barbara, her expression serious. "But the only opinion that matters is yours. What does your heart tell you?" Barbara set down her coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hand. "My heart is thoroughly confused, Mrs. Patterson. Edward's proposal makes perfect sense from a practical standpoint, but you're not a ledger book to be balanced," Mrs. Patterson finished. "You're a woman with feelings and dreams and hopes that go beyond mere practicality. What were those hopes before you came west? What did you imagine your life might become?" It was a question Barbara had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts. "I hoped for partnership," she said slowly. "Someone to build something meaningful with. I hoped for companionship that might grow into affection, perhaps even love. I hoped for children, for a home that felt truly mine." She paused, looking out the window at the dusty main street. "I hoped to matter to someone, to be more than just a convenience or a solution to a problem." "And do you think Edward Harrison could offer those things?" "I don't know," Barbara admitted. "I don't know him well enough to judge. He seems honorable, intelligent, and hard-working, but there's something guarded about him, something that makes me wonder if he's capable of the kind of partnership I'm seeking." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "Edward's had a hard life in some ways. Lost his parents young, like you did. Came west alone, built his ranch from nothing. Men like that sometimes forget how to let people close, even when they want to. You know him well?" "Well enough. He's been coming to Millbrook for supplies and business for about 6 years now. Always polite, always fair in his dealings, but never really part of the community the way Samuel was. Samuel would come to town and end up in 3 different conversations. Before he made it to the general store, Edward conducts his business and leaves." Barbara absorbed this information, trying to build a clearer picture of the man who had proposed marriage to her. "Mrs. Patterson, Would you think me foolish if I asked to spend some time learning more about Edward before giving him an answer? Perhaps visiting his ranch, seeing how he lives. I'd think you were wise, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. Marriage is the most important decision a woman makes. You have every right to gather all the information you can before choosing. Fortified by Mrs. Patterson's support, Barbara spent the morning exploring Millbrook more thoroughly. She visited the general store, where the proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, proved to be a fountain of information about the local community. She learned that the town had been founded only 8 years earlier, when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains, but that it had grown rapidly as word spread about the quality of the ore deposits. Of course, mining towns can be rough places, Mr. Jenkins explained as he measured out fabric for another customer. But Millbrook's been different from the start. We got families here, not just fortune seekers passing through, people who want to build something lasting. And the Harrison brothers, Barbara asked casually, were they part of that founding community? Samuel was, Mr. Jenkins replied. Came to town about 4 years back, full of plans and ideas, always talking about the future, about how the town could grow and prosper. Edward's more recent only started coming around regularly when Samuel bought that property for his house. Barbara thanked Mr. Jenkins and continued her exploration, stopping at the schoolhouse where she met Miss Catherine Wells, the young teacher who managed the education of Millbrook's children. Miss Wells was perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Barbara immediately respected. I heard you were a governess back east, Miss Wells said as she showed Barbara around the small but well-equipped schoolroom. We could certainly use help here. I have 32 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, all in one room. It's challenging, to say the least. What subjects do you cover? Barbara asked, examining the carefully organized supplies and noting the evident care Miss Wells took with her students' education. Reading, writing, arithmetic, of course, some geography and history. I try to include basic science when I can, and I've been teaching the older girls some bookkeeping skills. The boys learn mostly from their fathers, mining, ranching, carpentry, but I wish I could offer more advanced instruction for those who show aptitude. Barbara felt a spark of genuine interest. What kind of advanced instruction? Literature, advanced mathematics, perhaps some basic Latin for those planning to continue their education. Music and art, if we could find someone qualified to teach them, Miss Wells smiled. I know it sounds ambitious for a mining town, but some of these children are remarkably bright. They deserve every opportunity we can provide. As they talked, Barbara found herself imagining what it might be like to work alongside Miss Wells, to help shape young minds and contribute something meaningful to the community's future. It would be rewarding work, the kind that could provide purpose even without the security of marriage. Miss Wells, she said impulsively, if I were to remain in Millbrook, either married or unmarried, would there be a place for me in your school? Unmarried? Miss Wells raised an eyebrow. You're considering remaining single. Barbara realized she had revealed more than she intended. I'm weighing all my options. Marriage isn't the only path available to women, even here. Miss Wells studied her for a long moment. No, it's not, though it's certainly the most conventional path, especially for women in your circumstances. She paused, then continued more quietly. I've remained unmarried by choice, Miss Coleman. It's not an easy path in a place like this, but it's not impossible. If you have the courage for it, there are ways to build a meaningful life without a husband. Barbara felt a flush of warmth at this unexpected praise. I didn't realize he shared our correspondence with you. He was excited about the future he imagined with you, not just the marriage, but the partnership. He thought you could help him build something important, something that would last long after the silver ran out. Edward turned back to face her. After reading your letters, I found myself wondering what it would be like to have that kind of partnership with someone. Someone who could challenge me, make me think beyond the immediate concerns of running a ranch. The honesty in his admission surprised Barbara. It was the first time Edward had revealed anything approaching vulnerability, and it made her see him in a new light. "And you think I could be that person for you?" "I think you could be that person for any man fortunate enough to earn your respect and affection," Edward said simply. "The question is whether I'm capable of being the kind of partner you deserve." It was a question Barbara couldn't answer, at least not yet. But Edward's willingness to ask it, to acknowledge his own uncertainties, told her something important about his character. This was not a man who saw marriage as simply acquiring a housekeeper or companion. He was looking for something deeper, even if he wasn't entirely sure how to find it. As the afternoon wore on, and they prepared to return to Millbrook, Barbara realized that her understanding of Edward Harrison had shifted dramatically. He was still largely a stranger, still a man whose proposal came at a time when her options were limited. But he was also more thoughtful, more complex, and more genuinely interested in partnership than she had initially believed. The ride back to town was quieter than their morning journey, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Barbara found herself comparing the two futures she was considering: marriage to Edward, with its promise of security and partnership, but also its risks and unknowns, or independence, with its freedom and self-determination, but also its challenges and uncertainties. As the lights of Millbrook appeared ahead of them, Barbara realized that she was no closer to a decision than she had been that morning. But she was closer to understanding what the decision really involved, and what she might be choosing between. For the first time since arriving in Nevada, she felt like she was making progress toward a future that might actually belong to her. Rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances had handed her, the question now was whether she had the courage to reach for what she truly wanted, assuming she could figure out what that was. 3 days after visiting the Circle H Ranch, Barbara found herself accepting an invitation that would have shocked her former Philadelphia self. Edward had asked her to accompany him to the monthly community dance at the Millbrook Town Hall, and despite every social convention that suggested she should decline, she was, after all, supposed to be in mourning for the man she had come to marry. She had said yes. The decision hadn't been made lightly. Barbara had spent those 3 days in careful consideration, weighing her options with the methodical approach that had served her well as a governess. She had made lists of advantages and disadvantages, consulted with Mrs. Patterson about the realities of frontier life, and even drafted 2 letters, one to a distant cousin in Boston, inquiring about employment prospects back east, and another to Miss Wells expressing serious interest in a teaching position, but she had mailed neither letter. Instead, she found herself drawn repeatedly to the window of her boarding-house room, looking out toward the mountains where Edward's ranch lay hidden in their folds. Something about their last conversation had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, his admission that he wondered if he was capable of being the kind of partner she deserved. It was the question of a man who understood that marriage should be more than convenience, even if he wasn't sure how to achieve that understanding. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and paper lanterns for the monthly social gathering. As Edward helped Barbara down from his buggy, she could hear the cheerful sounds of fiddle music and laughter spilling out into the crisp evening air. Nearly the entire population of Millbrook seemed to have turned out for the event, from young children who would fall asleep in their mother's arms before the evening was over, to elderly couples who had been dancing together for decades. "I should warn you," Edward said quietly as they approached the entrance. "People will stare. We'll be the subject of considerable speculation tonight." Barbara smoothed her best dress, a deep blue silk that she had saved for special occasions. "Back in Philadelphia. Let them speculate. I've found that trying to control what people think is usually a futile exercise." Edward's mouth quivered in what might have been admiration. "I'm beginning to understand why Samuel was so impressed by your letters." Inside the hall, Barbara was struck by the warmth and energy of the gathering. The social divisions that might have been rigid in an eastern city seemed more fluid here. Miners danced with shopkeepers' daughters, the town's banker shared a drink with men whose hands were permanently stained with silver ore, and children from all social levels played together. In the corners of the room, Miss Coleman, Miss Wells appeared at Barbara's elbow, her usually serious face bright with pleasure. "I'm so glad you decided to come. And Mr. Harrison, I don't believe I've seen you at one of our dances before." "I'm not much of a dancer," Edward admitted, his discomfort obvious, but Miss Coleman expressed interest in meeting more members of the community. Barbara studied Edward's tense posture and realized that this gathering represented as much of a challenge for him as it did for her, though for different reasons. She was concerned about social judgment. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the social interaction itself. "Perhaps you could introduce Miss Coleman to some of the other ladies," Edward suggested to Miss Wells. "I should speak with a few of the ranchers about some business matters." As Edward moved away, Miss Wells gave Barbara a knowing look. "He's not used to social gatherings, is he? I've heard he's quite different from Samuel in that regard." "Very different," Barbara agreed, watching as Edward joined a group of men near the refreshment table. Even there, she could see his reserve, the way he listened more than he spoke, and maintained a slight physical distance from the others. Miss Wells introduced Barbara to several women, including Mrs. Janet Morrison, the preacher's wife, and Mrs. Sarah Chen, whose husband ran the local assay office. The conversations were polite but probing, with each woman clearly curious about Barbara's intentions regarding Edward Harrison. "It's romantic, in a way," Mrs. Morrison said as they watched. "The dancing, like something from a novel, finding love in the midst of tragedy. Though some might say it's rather quick," added Mrs. Chen with diplomatic caution. "Grief should have its proper time." Barbara felt compelled to set the record straight. "Mr. Harrison and I haven't spoken of love, Mrs. Chen. His proposal is based on practical considerations, mutual benefit rather than romantic attachment." The two women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinions of purely practical marriages. Mrs. Morrison, clearly the more forthright of the two, leaned closer to Barbara. "My dear, if you don't mind some unsolicited advice. Practical considerations are all well and good, but they won't warm your bed on cold nights or comfort you when times get difficult. A marriage needs something more substantial to survive." "And what would you suggest that something should be?" Barbara asked, genuinely curious about these women's perspectives. "Respect," Mrs. Chen said immediately. "Mutual respect and genuine fondness. Love can grow from those foundations, but it rarely grows from pure convenience." "And do you think Edward Harrison is capable of such feelings?" Barbara asked, surprising herself with her directness. Mrs. Morrison considered the question seriously. "Edward's always been a mystery to most of us. He's fair in his business dealings, generous when there's real need, but he keeps himself apart. Samuel was the one who made friends easily, who seemed to genuinely enjoy people's company. But that doesn't mean Edward lacks the capacity for deep feeling," Mrs. Chen added thoughtfully. "Sometimes the quieter ones feel things more intensely. They just don't know how to express it." Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement of a group dance that required participation from most of the adults in the room. Barbara looked around for Edward and found him approaching with obvious reluctance. "I believe this dance requires partners," he said to Barbara, extending his hand with the air of a man facing execution. Barbara took his hand, noting how warm and calloused it was from years of ranch work. "I should mention that I'm not an experienced dancer either. We may both embarrass ourselves. At least we'll do it together," Edward replied, and Barbara was pleased to hear a hint of humor in his voice. Barbara felt a flush of warmth at this unexpected praise. "I didn't realize he shared our correspondence with you." He was excited about the future he imagined with you, not just the marriage, but the partnership. He thought you could help him build something important, something that would last long after the silver ran out. Edward turned back to face her. "After reading your letters, I found myself wondering what it would be like to have that kind of partnership with someone who could challenge me, make me think beyond the immediate concerns of running a ranch." The honesty in his admission surprised Barbara. It was the first time Edward had revealed anything approaching vulnerability, and it made her see him in a new light. "And you think I could be that person for you?" "I think you could be that person for any man fortunate enough to earn your respect and affection," Edward said simply. "The question is whether I'm capable of being the kind of partner you deserve." It was a question Barbara couldn't answer, at least not yet. But Edward's willingness to ask it, to acknowledge his own uncertainties, told her something important about his character. This was not a man who saw marriage as simply acquiring a housekeeper or companion. He was looking for something deeper, even if he wasn't entirely sure how to find it. As the afternoon wore on, and they prepared to return to Millbrook, Barbara realized that her understanding of Edward Harrison had shifted dramatically. He was still largely a stranger, still a man whose proposal came at a time when her options were limited. But he was also more thoughtful, more complex, and more genuinely interested in partnership than she had initially believed. The ride back to town was quieter than their morning journey, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Barbara found herself comparing the two futures she was considering: marriage to Edward, with its promise of security and partnership, but also its risks and unknowns, or independence, with its freedom and self-determination, but also its challenges and uncertainties. As the lights of Millbrook appeared ahead of them, Barbara realized that she was no closer to a decision than she had been that morning. But she was closer to understanding what the decision really involved, and what she might be choosing between. For the first time since arriving in Nevada, she felt like she was making progress toward a future that might actually belong to her. Rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances had handed her, the question now was whether she had the courage to reach for what she truly wanted, assuming she could figure out what that was. 3 days after visiting the Circle H Ranch, Barbara found herself accepting an invitation that would have shocked her former Philadelphia self. Edward had asked her to accompany him to the monthly community dance at the Millbrook Town Hall, and despite every social convention that suggested she should decline, she was, after all, supposed to be in mourning for the man she had come to marry. She had said yes. The decision hadn't been made lightly. Barbara had spent those 3 days in careful consideration, weighing her options with the methodical approach that had served her well as a governess. She had made lists of advantages and disadvantages, consulted with Mrs. Patterson about the realities of frontier life, and even drafted 2 letters, one to a distant cousin in Boston, inquiring about employment prospects back east, and another to Miss Wells expressing serious interest in a teaching position, but she had mailed neither letter. Instead, she found herself drawn repeatedly to the window of her boarding house room, looking out toward the mountains where Edward's ranch lay hidden in their folds. Something about their last conversation had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, his admission that he wondered if he was capable of being the kind of partner she deserved. It was the question of a man who understood that marriage should be more than convenience, even if he wasn't sure how to achieve that understanding. The key town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and paper lanterns for the monthly social gathering. As Edward helped Barbara down from his buggy, she could hear the cheerful sounds of fiddle music and laughter spilling out into the crisp evening air. Nearly the entire population of Millbrook seemed to have turned out for the event, from young children who would fall asleep in their mother's arms before the evening was over, to elderly couples who had been dancing together for decades. "I should warn you," Edward said quietly as they approached the entrance. "People will stare. We'll be the subject of considerable speculation tonight." Barbara smoothed her best dress, a deep blue silk that she had saved for special occasions, back in Philadelphia. "Let them speculate. I've found that trying to control what people think is usually a futile exercise." Edward's mouth quivered in what might have been admiration. "I'm beginning to understand why Samuel was so impressed by your letters." Inside the hall, Barbara was struck by the warmth and energy of the gathering. The social divisions that might have been rigid in an eastern city seemed more fluid here. Miners danced with shopkeepers' daughters, the town's banker shared a drink with men whose hands were permanently stained with silver ore, and children from all social levels played together. In the corners of the room, Miss Coleman, Miss Wells appeared at Barbara's elbow, her usually serious face bright with pleasure. "I'm so glad you decided to come. And Mr. Harrison, I don't believe I've seen you at one of our dances before." "I'm not much of a dancer," Edward admitted, his discomfort obvious, but Miss Coleman expressed interest in meeting more members of the community. Barbara studied Edward's tense posture and realized that this gathering represented as much of a challenge for him as it did for her, though for different reasons. She was concerned about social judgment. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the social interaction itself. "Perhaps you could introduce Miss Coleman to some of the other ladies," Edward suggested to Miss Wells. "I should speak with a few of the ranchers about some business matters." As Edward moved away, Miss Wells gave Barbara a knowing look. "He's not used to social gatherings, is he? I've heard he's quite different from Samuel in that regard." "Very different," Barbara agreed, watching as Edward joined a group of men near the refreshment table. Even there, she could see his reserve, the way he listened more than he spoke, and maintained a slight physical distance from the others. Miss Wells introduced Barbara to several women, including Mrs. Janet Morrison, the preacher's wife, and Mrs. Sarah Chen, whose husband ran the local assay office. The conversations were polite but probing, with each woman clearly curious about Barbara's intentions regarding Edward Harrison. "It's romantic, in a way," Mrs. Morrison said as they watched. "The dancing, like something from a novel, finding love in the midst of tragedy. Though some might say it's rather quick," added Mrs. Chen with diplomatic caution. "Grief should have its proper time." Barbara felt compelled to set the record straight. "Mr. Harrison and I haven't spoken of love, Mrs. Chen. His proposal is based on practical considerations, mutual benefit rather than romantic attachment." The two women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinions of purely practical marriages. Mrs. Morrison, clearly the more forthright of the two, leaned closer to Barbara. "My dear, if you don't mind some unsolicited advice. Practical considerations are all well and good, but they won't warm your bed on cold nights or comfort you when times get difficult. A marriage needs something more substantial to survive." "And what would you suggest that something should be?" Barbara asked, genuinely curious about these women's perspectives. "Respect," Mrs. Chen said immediately. "Mutual respect and genuine fondness. Love can grow from those foundations, but it rarely grows from pure convenience." "And do you think Edward Harrison is capable of such feelings?" Barbara asked, surprising herself with her directness. Mrs. Morrison considered the question seriously. "Edward's always been a mystery to most of us. He's fair in his business dealings, generous when there's real need, but he keeps himself apart. Samuel was the one who made friends easily, who seemed to genuinely enjoy people's company. But that doesn't mean Edward lacks the capacity for deep feeling," Mrs. Chen added thoughtfully. "Sometimes the quieter ones feel things more intensely. They just don't know how to express it." Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement of a group dance that required participation from most of the adults in the room. Barbara looked around for Edward and found him approaching with obvious reluctance. "I believe this dance requires partners," he said to Barbara, extending his hand with the air of a man facing execution. Barbara took his hand, noting how warm and calloused it was from years of ranch work. "I should mention that I'm not an experienced dancer either. We may both embarrass ourselves. At least we'll do it together," Edward replied, and Barbara was pleased to hear a hint of humor in his voice. The dance proved to be less challenging than either had feared. It was a simple pattern that most of the participants knew well, and the other couples were patient with Barbara and Edward's occasional missteps. Barbara found herself laughing at their mistakes and was delighted to see Edward's rigid posture gradually relaxing as the music carried them through the movements. "You're a better dancer than you claimed," Barbara said, as they completed one of the figures successfully. "You bring out my hidden talents," Edward replied, and this time his smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. For the first time since meeting him, Barbara caught a glimpse of what Edward Harrison might be, like if he allowed himself to truly relax, to let down the careful guard he maintained against the world. It was an appealing vision, this man who could smile with such warmth when he forgot to be cautious. As the evening progressed, Barbara found herself observing Edward's interactions with other community members. She noticed how respectfully he treated everyone, regardless of their social position. She saw him quietly slip money to a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, and watched him listen with genuine attention to an elderly man's long-winded story about the early days of Millbrook's founding. During a break between dances, Dr. Richard Thompson, the town's physician, approached them with his wife Elena. Barbara had heard about Dr. Thompson but hadn't yet met him. He was reportedly one of the few college-educated men in Millbrook, having given up a promising career in San Francisco to serve the frontier community. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Coleman," Dr. Thompson said with a slight bow, "I wanted to offer my condolences about Samuel and to welcome Miss Coleman to our community." "Thank you, Doctor," Barbara replied. "I understand you're originally from California." "San Francisco, yes. I came here 2 years ago when the previous doctor retired." Dr. Thompson's wife, Elena, a petite woman with intelligent dark eyes, smiled warmly at Barbara. "We heard you might be interested in teaching," Elena said. "Richard and I have been hoping to establish some kind of cultural society, perhaps organizing lectures, musical performances, dramatic readings. Someone with your background could be invaluable in such an endeavor." Barbara felt a spark of excitement at the suggestion. "That sounds wonderful. I'd be very interested in participating." "You see," Edward said quietly, "I told you this community. He could use your talents." Barbara glanced at him, surprised by the pride in his voice. He genuinely seemed pleased by the idea that she might find meaningful work in Millbrook, even work that didn't directly relate to his marriage proposal. As the evening drew toward its close, Barbara found herself walking outside with Edward for some fresh air. The night was clear and cold, with more stars visible than she had ever seen in Philadelphia. The sounds of the continuing dance were muted by distance, creating an island of relative quiet in the midst of the celebration. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," Barbara said. "I needed to see how I might fit into this community." "And what's your assessment?" Edward asked, his voice carefully neutral. Barbara considered the question seriously. "I think I could build a life here. There are opportunities for meaningful work, and the people seem genuinely welcoming. It's not what I expected when I left Philadelphia, but it could be good." "Even without marriage?" Edward asked. "You could support yourself through teaching. Perhaps start that cultural society with the Thompsons." Barbara turned to study his face in the starlight. "Are you trying to talk me out of your proposal, Mr. Harrison?" Edward was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to make sure you understand that you have choices, real choices. I don't want you to marry me simply because you think it's your only option." The honesty of his response surprised Barbara. Most men in his position would be pressing their advantage, not pointing out alternatives that might work against their interests. "Why is that important to you?" she asked. Edward leaned against the porch railing, his face turned toward the mountains. "Because I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about hoping to matter to someone. I realize that I want the same thing. I want to matter to the woman I marry, not just provide her with security and convenience." "And you don't think I could come to feel that way about you?" "I don't know," Edward admitted. "I'm not like Samuel. I don't have his gift for making people feel comfortable, for inspiring affection. I'm not sure I know how to be the kind of husband a woman like you deserves." Barbara found his uncertainty oddly endearing. A more confident man might have made promises he couldn't keep, might have tried to convince her with words, rather than allowing her to see his character through his actions. "Edward," she said softly, "may I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "Have you ever been in love? Really, truly in love?" Edward's expression grew shuttered. "Once. A long time ago." "What happened?" "She decided she preferred a man with better prospects and fewer rough edges," Edward said simply. "She wasn't wrong. He could give her things I couldn't. A house in town, status, security, without the risks that come with frontier life." Barbara heard the old pain in his voice, carefully controlled, but still present. "Is that why you've remained unmarried? Because of that disappointment?" "Partly. But also because I learned that love isn't always enough. Practical considerations matter, especially out here. A marriage needs solid foundations if it's going to survive the challenges this life can throw at it. So you're offering me a marriage based on those solid foundations, rather than romantic love. I'm offering you a partnership," Edward corrected, "based on mutual respect, shared goals, and the hope that deeper feelings might develop over time. It's not the romance novels promise, but it might be more durable." Barbara considered his words as they walked back toward the buggy. Edward's proposal was beginning to make more sense to her, not as a desperate arrangement between strangers, but as a thoughtful attempt to build something lasting based on realistic expectations. As Edward helped her into the buggy for the ride back to town, Barbara realized that her feelings about his proposal had shifted significantly over the course of the evening. She had seen him interact with his community and had witnessed his kindness and integrity in a dozen small ways. She had also seen glimpses of the man behind his careful reserve, someone capable of warmth and humor when he felt safe enough to let them show. "Edward," she said as they drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, "I'd like to give you my answer to your proposal." Edward's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "All right. I'd like to accept, but with conditions." Edward pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the boarding house and turned to face her fully. "What conditions?" "I want a courtship first. A real courtship, not just a business negotiation. I want time for us to get to know each other better before we commit to marriage." "How much time?" Edward asked. 2 months. Long enough for us to move past politeness and see each other as we really are. If at the end of that time we both still believe we can build a good life together, then we'll marry." Edward considered this for a long moment. "And if we decide we don't suit each other, then we part as friends, and I'll pursue other options. And for my future," Edward extended his hand to her. "Miss Coleman, I believe we have an agreement." As Barbara shook his hand, she felt a sense of rightness about the decision that surprised her. She wasn't committing to marriage yet, but she was committing to the possibility of marriage with a man who had shown her respect, honesty, and genuine concern for her well-being. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Barbara felt like she was actively choosing her future rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond her control. It was a good feeling, and as Edward walked her to the boarding house door, she found herself looking forward to discovering what the next 2 months might bring. The first week of October brought unseasonably warm weather to the Nevada territory, and with it, an unexpected visitor to Millbrook that would test everything Barbara and Edward had begun to build between them. Barbara was helping Miss Wells reorganize the school's library when Deputy Stevens burst through the schoolhouse door, his weathered face flushed with exertion and concern. "Miss Wells, Miss Coleman," he said, breathing hard. "I need to speak with you both. There's been some trouble." Barbara set down the stack of primers she'd been sorting. "What kind of trouble, Deputy?" "Samuel Harrison's cousin, Silas Thornton, is back in town. Came in on the morning stage with a lawyer from Carson City and some kind of court document. They're claiming that Samuel's will is invalid, that Miss Coleman has no right to the inheritance, and that the property should go to Silas as next of kin." Barbara felt the blood drain from her face. The $500 Samuel had left her represented her only real security, her guarantee that she could support herself regardless of what happened with Edward's courtship. Without it, she would be entirely dependent on whatever charity the community might offer. "On what grounds are they challenging the will?" Miss Wells asked, her teacher's mind immediately focusing on the practical details. The lawyers claimed that since Samuel and Miss Coleman weren't actually married, she had no legal standing to inherit anything. Says the will was written under emotional duress and doesn't represent Samuel's true intentions. Barbara sank into one of the student desks, her legs suddenly unsteady. "But Judge Wilson said the will was perfectly legal. Samuel specifically provided for me, knowing we weren't married yet." "That's what I told them," Deputy Stevens said grimly. "But this Carson City lawyer seems to think he knows more about territorial law than our local judge. They're demanding a hearing to contest the will, and they've got the territorial judge coming down from Virginia City to preside." Miss Wells moved to Barbara's side, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "When is this hearing supposed to take place?" 3 days from now, Monday morning at the courthouse." Deputy Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else. Silas Thornton is also claiming that Edward Harrison pressured Miss Coleman into accepting his marriage proposal, taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. He's suggesting that the whole thing is some kind of conspiracy to keep Samuel's money in the Harrison family." Barbara's shock gave way to anger. "That's absolutely ridiculous. Edward has been nothing but honorable in his dealings with me. If anything, he's gone out of his way to make sure I understand my options. I know that, and you know that," Deputy Stevens said. "But Silas Thornton is painting a different picture. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're being manipulated by Edward, that you need protecting from his influence." The schoolhouse door opened again, and Edward himself appeared, his face grim with barely controlled fury. "Deputy Stevens, I just heard about Thornton's accusations. Where can I find him?" "Edward, no," Barbara said quickly, rising from the desk. "Confronting him will only make things worse. It will look like you're trying to intimidate me or control the situation." Edward's jaw tightened. "I won't stand by while that man maligns your character or questions your ability to make your own decisions." "Then don't stand by," Barbara said, meeting his eyes directly. "Stand with me. Help me fight this legally, properly, in a way that proves we have nothing to hide." Deputy Stevens cleared his throat. "If you're planning to contest Thornton's challenge, you'll need legal representation. Judge Morrison can handle simple matters, but this is going to require someone with real expertise in territorial inheritance law." "There's a lawyer in Virginia City," Edward said. "Marcus Webb. He handled the paperwork when I bought my ranch. He's honest and knows the law. Can he be here by Monday?" Barbara asked. "I'll ride out today and bring him back myself if necessary," Edward replied. "But Barbara, you should know. Fighting this is going to be expensive. Legal fees, court costs, bringing witnesses from Virginia City. It could cost more than the inheritance is worth." Barbara lifted her chin defiantly. "This isn't just about the money anymore, Edward. It's about the principle. Samuel left me that inheritance because he felt a moral obligation to provide for my welfare. I won't let his cousin steal it simply because he thinks I'm an easy target." Miss Wells spoke up. "You'll have support from the community, Barbara. People here knew Samuel, and they knew his character. They'll testify that he was of sound mind when he wrote that will." "Will they?" Barbara asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Or will they think Silas Thornton has a point? After all, I'm a stranger who showed up claiming to be Samuel's intended bride. Some people might find his version of events more believable." Edward stepped closer to her, his voice low and intense. "Barbara, look at me. Do you believe you have a right to that inheritance?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Do you believe Samuel left it to you in good faith, knowing exactly what he was doing?" "Yes." "Then we fight," Edward said simply. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I won't let anyone make you doubt your own worth or question your right to the consideration Samuel wanted you to have." The strength in his voice, the absolute certainty of his support, surprised Barbara. This was not the reserved, cautious man she had first met. This was someone willing to commit resources and reputation to defend her, even though their own relationship was still in its early stages. Deputy Stevens nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. I'll start gathering character witnesses for Samuel, people who can testify about his state of mind in the weeks before his death. And I'll keep an eye on Thornton and his lawyer, make sure they don't try any underhanded tactics." After the deputy left, Barbara found herself alone with Edward and Miss Wells in the schoolhouse. The afternoon light was slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across the student desks and reminding Barbara of how much her life had changed since arriving in Millbrook just 2 weeks earlier. "Edward," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. If we fight this legal challenge and lose, I'll have nothing. No inheritance, no savings, no security except what I can earn through teaching. Would you still want to marry me under those circumstances?" Edward didn't hesitate. "Barbara, I proposed to you before I knew about Samuel's inheritance. Your financial situation wasn't part of my considerations then, and it isn't now." "But it would make things more difficult," Barbara pressed. "A wife who brings nothing to the marriage except her own support needs. A wife who brings intelligence, courage, and the ability to build something meaningful alongside her husband," Edward corrected. "Those qualities don't have a monetary value, but they're worth more than any inheritance." Miss Wells, who had been quietly listening to their exchange, smiled softly. "If you don't mind my saying so, this crisis seems to be bringing out the best in both of you. Sometimes it takes external pressure to reveal what people are really made of." Over the next 3 days, Millbrook buzzed with activity as word of the legal challenge spread throughout the community. Barbara was touched by the number of people who approached her with offers of support. Mrs. Patterson refused to accept payment for her room and board. Dr. Thompson and his wife invited her to dinner and assured her of their testimony regarding Samuel's mental state. Even some of the miners who had barely spoken to her before stopped her on the street to express their outrage at Silas Thornton's accusations. But there was also opposition. Mrs. Fairchild made pointed comments about inappropriate relationships and fortune hunters, though she was careful not to make direct accusations that could be challenged. A few of the more conservative residents seemed to think that perhaps Silas Thornton had a point about the propriety of the situation. Edward returned from Virginia City on Saturday evening with Marcus Webb, a thin, intense man in his 40s who exuded competence and determination. Webb spent Sunday reviewing all the relevant documents and interviewing potential witnesses, building what he assured Barbara was a strong case for upholding Samuel's will. "The law is clear," Webb explained as they met in Judge Wilson's office. Sunday evening, A man has the right to dispose of his property as he sees fit, provided he's of sound mind and not under duress. Samuel Harrison's will was properly witnessed and filed, and there's no evidence he was anything other than completely rational when he wrote it. But what about Thornton's argument that I had no standing to inherit since we weren't married? Barbara asked. Irrelevant, Webb said firmly. Samuel specifically acknowledged in the will that you weren't married yet, but that he felt a moral obligation to provide for you given the commitment you had made in traveling west to marry him. That shows clear intent and understanding of the circumstances. Judge Wilson nodded agreement. Samuel was always precise in his language, both spoken and written. If he'd had any doubts about the propriety of the request, he would have said so. Monday morning dawned cold and overcast, with a sharp wind that rattled the windows of the courthouse and seemed to promise an early winter. Barbara dressed carefully in her most respectable outfit, a severe black dress that emphasized her dignity and respectability. Edward arrived to escort her to the courthouse, looking impressive in a formal black suit that transformed him from a working rancher into someone who could command respect in any courtroom. The courthouse was packed with spectators, nearly the entire population of Millbrook having turned out to witness the proceedings. Barbara was surprised to see how many faces looked supportive, offering encouraging nods and smiles as she made her way to the front of the room. Judge Harrison from Virginia City was an elderly man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he had little patience for frivolous legal challenges. Silas Thornton and his lawyer, a slick-looking man named Carlyle, sat at one table, while Barbara, Edward, and Marcus Webb occupied the other. "This court is now in session," Judge Harrison announced. "We're here to consider a challenge to the last will and testament of Samuel Harrison, specifically regarding a bequest to Miss Barbara Coleman. Mr. Carlyle, you may present your case." Carlyle rose with theatrical flourish, clearly relishing his moment in the spotlight. "Your Honor, this case represents a clear abuse of a vulnerable woman by unscrupulous individuals seeking to manipulate her for financial gain. Miss Coleman was lured west under false pretenses, then immediately subjected to pressure and manipulation designed to keep Samuel Harrison's rightful inheritance within the Harrison family circle." Barbara felt her cheeks burn at the suggestion that she was some kind of helpless victim, but Webb had instructed her to remain silent unless specifically asked to testify. Carlyle continued his opening statement, painting a picture of Barbara as a naive Eastern woman, easily deceived and manipulated by the Harrison brothers. He suggested that Samuel's will had been written under emotional duress, influenced by romantic fantasies that didn't reflect his true intentions. "Furthermore," Carlyle said, his voice rising dramatically, "the unseemly haste with which Miss Coleman accepted Edward Harrison's marriage proposal immediately after Samuel's death suggests a prearranged conspiracy to maintain control over the deceased's assets." When Carlyle finished, Webb rose for his opening statement. His approach was completely different, calm, methodical, focused on facts rather than emotions. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple. Samuel Harrison was an intelligent, successful businessman who wrote a clear, legally valid will disposing of his property according to his wishes. No evidence has been presented to suggest he was anything other than completely rational when he made these decisions. The challenge before this court is based entirely on speculation and innuendo, not on legal grounds. The first witness called was Dr. Thompson, who testified about Samuel's mental state in the weeks before his death. "Samuel Harrison was as sharp and clear-thinking as any man I've known," the doctor said. "He spoke frequently about his upcoming marriage, about his plans for the future. There was nothing in his demeanor or conversation to suggest any kind of mental incapacity or emotional distress." Mrs. Patterson followed, describing Samuel's excitement about Barbara's arrival and his careful preparations for married life. "He showed me her photograph and letters," she testified, "said she was exactly the kind of woman he'd hoped to find, educated, capable, someone who could help him build something lasting. But it was Frank Martinez, Edward's foreman, who provided the most compelling testimony. Samuel came out to Circle H about a week before he died," Frank said. "He and Edward spent the evening talking about Miss Coleman, about Samuel's plans for their life together. Samuel said he wanted to make sure she'd be provided for if anything happened to him before they could marry. He said it was only right, given the sacrifice she was making in coming west." Carlyle tried to undermine the testimony through cross-examination, suggesting that the witnesses were biased in favor of the Harrison family. But his attacks seemed to backfire, making him appear to be bullying respected members of the community. When it came time for Barbara to testify, she took the witness stand with as much dignity as she could muster. Webb's questions were straightforward, allowing her to tell her story simply and honestly. "Miss Coleman," Webb said, "did Samuel Harrison make any promises to you beyond marriage itself?" "He promised to provide a comfortable home and to treat me with respect," Barbara replied. "He also said that if anything happened to him before our marriage, he would make sure I wasn't left stranded without resources." "Did you come west expecting any inheritance or financial benefit beyond the security of marriage?" "No. I expected to earn my keep through partnership with my husband, helping with business correspondence and household management." "And when Edward Harrison proposed marriage to you, was there any discussion of Samuel's inheritance?" "None whatsoever. Mr. Harrison made his proposal before Samuel's will was even read. The inheritance was never a factor in my consideration of his offer." Carlyle's cross-examination was aggressive, clearly designed to rattle Barbara and make her appear mercenary or deceptive, but his tactics had the opposite effect. Barbara's calm, straightforward responses made his attack seem unfair and unwarranted. "Miss Coleman," Carlyle said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you accepted Edward Harrison's proposal immediately after learning about your inheritance? Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "I accepted Mr. Harrison's courtship, not his proposal," Barbara corrected firmly, "and I did so because I judged him to be a man of integrity and character, not because of any financial considerations." "Character?" Carlyle pressed. "You'd known him for all of one day when you made this decision. How could you possibly judge his character in such a short time?" Barbara met his gaze directly. "I judged his character by his actions, Mr. Carlyle. He offered to help me return east, if that was what I chose. He showed me respect when I had no claim on his consideration. He defended my right to make my own decisions when others suggested I was incapable of doing so. Those actions told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he is." When the testimony concluded, Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before rendering his decision. Barbara found herself surrounded by supporters from the community, all expressing confidence in the outcome, but she noticed that Silas Thornton and his lawyer seemed far from defeated, talking intently in hushed tones near the back of the courtroom. "Whatever the judge decides," Edward said quietly, "you've conducted yourself with more dignity and grace than anyone could have expected. I'm proud to be associated with you." The words meant more to Barbara than any declaration of love could have. In the space of a few days, she and Edward had faced their first real test as a potential couple, and they had emerged stronger for it. She was beginning to understand that the partnership Edward offered might be exactly what she needed, not romance or passion, but solid support and unwavering respect. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's decision was swift and unambiguous. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, this court finds no grounds for overturning Samuel Harrison's will. The bequest to Miss Barbara Coleman stands as written, and Mr. Silas Thornton's challenge is denied. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Barbara barely heard it. She was looking at Edward, seeing the relief and pride in his expression and realizing that something fundamental had shifted between them during this crisis. They had begun as strangers, negotiating a practical arrangement. They were ending as partners who had proven they could stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. The victory in court marked a turning point not just in Barbara's legal standing, but in her relationship with Edward and her place in the Millbrook community. As October progressed into November, their courtship took on a rhythm that felt both natural and purposeful. Edward visited Barbara 3 times a week, taking her on rides through the countryside, sharing meals at the boarding house, and engaging in long conversations that revealed new depths to both their characters. During one particularly memorable afternoon, Edward surprised Barbara by taking her to Samuel's unfinished house, not to discuss practical matters, but to share something more personal. He had brought a picnic basket and a worn leather journal that Barbara had never seen before. "I thought you might like to read some of Samuel's thoughts about this place," Edward said, as they settled on a blanket near the stone foundation. He kept detailed notes about his plans, but also about his hopes for the future. Barbara opened the journal carefully, immediately recognizing Samuel's neat handwriting from his letters to her. But these entries were different, more intimate, more revealing of the man behind the formal correspondence. "March 15th, 1882, she read aloud. "Purchased the Henderson tract today, 20 acres of good land with water rights and timber for building. Edward thinks I'm moving too fast, but I can see it all so clearly. The house where Charlotte and I will live, the gardens she'll plant, the children who will run through these fields someday. A man needs something to build toward, something larger than himself." Barbara paused, touched by the vision Samuel had recorded. "He called me Charlotte in his private notes. He said Barbara was too formal for someone who was going to be family." Edward explained. "He was planning to ask if he could call you Charlotte after you were married." As Barbara continued reading, she found herself understanding Samuel in a way his letters had never allowed. He wrote about his fears as well as his hopes, worries that he might not be worthy of the educated woman who had agreed to marry him, concerns about whether frontier life would prove too harsh for someone accustomed to Eastern comforts. He was more uncertain than he let on in his letters, Barbara observed. Samuel was good at projecting confidence, Edward agreed, but privately he worried about everything, whether his mining luck would hold, whether he could make the transition to farming, whether he could be the kind of husband you deserved. Barbara found herself moved by this glimpse into Samuel's private thoughts, but also struck by how different the real man was from the confident correspondent she had thought she was coming to marry. It made her appreciate even more the honesty Edward had shown her from the beginning, his willingness to acknowledge his uncertainties rather than hiding them behind false confidence. "There's something else," Edward said, reaching into the picnic basket to retrieve a small wrapped package. "Samuel had ordered this for you. It arrived on yesterday's stage." Barbara unwrapped the package to find a delicate music box made of polished maple wood. When she opened it, a tiny dancer spun to the melody of Beautiful Dreamer, while a folded note fell into her lap. "For Charlotte," she read, "to remind you that dreams can come true, even in the most unlikely places. With all my hopes for our future happiness, Samuel." The gift was both touching and heartbreaking, a reminder of the future that might have been, but also somehow a blessing on the future that was actually developing. Barbara found herself crying, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of gratitude and closure. "He would have been a good husband," she said softly. "Yes," Edward agreed, "but not the right husband for you." Barbara looked up at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "How can you be so sure?" Edward was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the half-built house before them. Because I've been reading Samuel's letters to you. Mrs. Patterson found them among his effects and thought you should have them. Reading them and reading his journal entries about you, I can see that you were both trying very hard to be the people you thought the other wanted. What do you mean? Samuel wrote to you as if he were more confident and settled than he actually was. You wrote to him as if you were more conventional and domestically focused than you actually are. You were both good people trying to make a practical arrangement work, but you weren't really seeing each other clearly. Barbara considered this observation, recognizing the truth in it. Her letters to Samuel had emphasized her skills as a household manager and her desire for domestic stability while downplaying her intellectual interests and her ambition for meaningful work beyond the home. "And you think we see each other more clearly?" she asked. "I think we started from a more honest place," Edward replied. "Neither of us tried to be anything other than what we are. You've seen me at my most socially awkward, and I've seen you at your most independently minded. If we choose each other, it's with full knowledge of what we're getting." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They looked up to see Frank Martinez riding toward them at a pace that suggested urgency. Edward rose immediately, his body language shifting into alert readiness. "Boss," Frank called as he dismounted, "we've got trouble at the ranch. That storm last night brought down trees across Willow Creek. The water's backing up, and if we don't clear it soon, we're going to lose the lower pastures to flooding." Edward's jaw tightened as he calculated the implications. "How bad is the blockage?" "Bad enough that we'll need every available man and probably some heavy equipment from town. Could take 2, maybe 3 days to clear properly." Barbara saw Edward's dilemma immediately. The ranch work was urgent and would require his full attention, but leaving her now would interrupt their courtship at a crucial moment. They had planned to attend the Harvest Festival together the following weekend, an event that would essentially announce their engagement to the entire community. "Go," Barbara said before Edward could struggle with the decision. "Your ranch and your men need you. But the festival will happen whether you're there or not," Barbara finished. "Edward, this is exactly the kind of situation where a real partner would understand that responsibilities come first." Edward studied her face, as if trying to determine whether she truly meant what she was saying or was simply being polite. "It could be a week before I can get back to town." "Then it's a week. I'm not going anywhere." Frank cleared his throat diplomatically. "Actually, Miss Coleman, if you're not opposed to the idea, you could come out to the ranch while we're dealing with this situation. Mrs. Fletcher could use help feeding the extra crews we'll need, and it would give you a chance to see what ranch life is really like during a crisis." Barbara felt a thrill of excitement at the suggestion. It would be unconventional, certainly, but it would also give her genuine insight into the kind of life she was considering. Would that be appropriate? "Mrs. Fletcher would be there to chaperone," Edward said slowly, "and Frank's wife, Maria, helps with the cooking when we have large crews. It wouldn't be just the 2 of us." "Then I'd like to come," Barbara said decisively. "I want to see what I'd be signing up for." The next few days provided Barbara with a comprehensive education in ranch crisis management. The flooding was more serious than initially expected, requiring not just the clearing of debris, but the construction of temporary channels to redirect the water flow. Barbara found herself working alongside Maria Martinez and Mrs. Fletcher to feed crews of 20 men 3 times a day, while also helping to organize the logistical coordination between different work teams. It was exhausting, demanding work that began before dawn and ended well after dark. Barbara's hands became rough from handling heavy pots and hauling water. Her dresses grew stained despite her apron, and her carefully styled hair fell into practical braids that could be tucked under a work bonnet. By the 3rd day, she looked nothing like the refined Eastern lady who had stepped off the train in Millbrook, but she had never felt more useful or more alive. "You're enjoying this," Edward observed on the evening of the fourth day. They were sitting on the ranch house porch, both too tired to do more than watch the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I am," Barbara admitted, surprised by her own response. "I should be exhausted and miserable, but instead I feel accomplished, like I'm contributing something real. Even though it's not the refined, civilized life you might have expected." Barbara looked down at her hands, calloused now from work she had never imagined doing. "I think I've learned something important about myself this week. I thought I wanted security and comfort, but what I actually want is purpose. I want to feel necessary, not just ornamental." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her profile in the fading light. "And how do you feel about the idea of spending your life dealing with crises like this one?" "Honestly, I think I'd be good at it. I like solving problems, organizing systems, and making things work efficiently. And I like the feeling that my efforts matter in a tangible way, even if it means giving up the possibility of a more conventional life, teaching perhaps, or working with Dr. Thompson's cultural society." Barbara turned to face him directly. "Edward, are you trying to talk me out of marrying you again?" Edward's expression grew serious. "I'm trying to make sure you know what you're choosing. This week has been unusual, but it's not unrepresentative. Ranch life involves constant challenges, unexpected problems, physical demands that Eastern society wouldn't consider appropriate for ladies. And you're worried I might regret it. I'm worried you might feel trapped by it, that you might look back in 5 years and wish you'd chosen differently." Barbara was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the week she had just experienced and what it revealed about her own capabilities and preferences. "Edward, may I ask you something?" "Of course. When you proposed this courtship, what were you hoping to discover about me?" Edward considered the question carefully. "I suppose I was hoping to discover whether you could be happy with the reality of frontier life, not just the idea of it. Whether you could find satisfaction in building something together, even when that building process is difficult and unglamorous. And what have you discovered? That you're stronger and more adaptable than I expected. That you don't just tolerate challenges, you seem to thrive on them. That you care more about meaningful work than about social status or conventional comforts." Barbara felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his assessment. "And what about you? What have I learned about you this week?" Edward shifted uncomfortably, as if the question made him self-conscious. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to judge that." "Then let me tell you," Barbara said, her voice growing confident. "I've learned that you're the kind of man who puts the welfare of his animals and his employees ahead of his own convenience. I've seen you work 18-hour days without complaint, solve problems with creativity and determination, and treat everyone from your foreman to the newest hired hand with respect and fairness." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "I've also learned that you're the kind of man who would sacrifice his own happiness to make sure his future wife had every chance to choose freely. You've spent this entire courtship period trying to make sure I understand my alternatives, even when those alternatives might take me away from you." Edward's expression grew soft in the twilight. "And how do you feel about that?" "I feel like I've found a true partner," Barbara said simply. "Not someone who wants to possess me or control me, but someone who wants to build something meaningful alongside me. Someone who respects my judgment enough to let me make my own choices, even when those choices involve risk." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them watching the last light fade from the sky. Barbara realized that this moment, sitting on a ranch porch after a day of hard physical labor, felt more romantic to her than any candlelit dinner or formal courtship ritual could have. "Barbara," Edward said finally, "I have something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her heart skip. "What is it?" "This morning, While you were helping Maria with the laundry, I received a telegram from a cattle buyer in San Francisco. He's offering to purchase my entire herd at prices that would double the ranch's value overnight. Barbara felt a chill of apprehension. And you're considering it? I'm considering what it might mean for our future. With that kind of money, we could go anywhere, do anything. You could return to the East if you wanted, live in comfort in a real city. Or we could travel, see the world, have experiences that frontier life could never offer. Barbara stared at him, trying to understand what he was really saying. Are you asking me what I want you to do? I'm asking what kind of life you really want. Not what you think you should want, or what circumstances have forced you to consider, but what would actually make you happy. It was perhaps the most important question anyone had ever asked her, and Barbara realized that a month ago she wouldn't have known how to answer it. But the past few weeks in Millbrook, and especially the past few days at the ranch, had taught her things about herself she had never suspected. I want this, she said, gesturing toward the ranch building silhouetted against the star-filled sky. I want to build something lasting with someone I respect and care about. I want work that matters and challenges that test what I'm capable of. I want to be part of a community where people depend on each other and take care of their own. She paused, then continued with growing certainty. I don't want ease, Edward. I want meaning. I want to know that my life has made a difference, that the work I do and the choices I make contribute to something larger than myself. Edward reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Then I won't sell the cattle, and I have one more question for you. What's that? Barbara Coleman, will you marry me? Not for practical reasons, not because your circumstances limit your choices, but because you want to spend your life as my partner in every sense of the word. Barbara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Yes, Edward Harrison, I will marry you because I love you and because I can't imagine a better future than the one we could build together. The kiss they shared on the ranch house porch was nothing like the tentative, polite kisses of their earlier courtship. It was passionate, committed, and full of promise for the future they had chosen together. As they finally pulled apart, Barbara realized that her long journey from Philadelphia to this moment had been worth every uncertainty, every challenge, every moment of doubt. She had come west as a mail-order bride seeking security. She was staying as a woman who had found love, purpose, and a true partner in the most unexpected of circumstances. The wedding would be in December, they decided, after the ranch work was caught up and they could take time to plan a proper celebration. But in every way that mattered, Barbara realized their real life together had already begun. 5 years had passed since Barbara Coleman stepped off the train in Millbrook, expecting to marry Samuel Harrison and instead finding herself at his funeral. Now, on a crisp December morning in 1887, Barbara Harrison stood on the porch of the completed house that Samuel had begun, watching her 3-year-old daughter Emma chase chickens in the yard, while her infant son Samuel, named for the man whose death had brought his parents together, slept peacefully in her arms. The house bore little resemblance to Samuel's original vision. Where he had planned formal parlors and a separate library, Barbara and Edward had created open, practical spaces that could accommodate the constant flow of ranch business and community gatherings. The kitchen had been expanded twice to handle the meals required for seasonal crews and the frequent visitors who now saw the Circle H Ranch as an unofficial community center for the growing agricultural movement in Nevada Territory. Barbara herself had changed just as dramatically. The refined Eastern lady who had once worried about her complexion and the propriety of her circumstances was now a woman whose hands bore the calluses of real work, whose face was touched by sun and wind, and whose confidence came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges frontier life might bring. She wore practical clothing designed for movement and utility, and her hair was pinned back in styles that could withstand a day of managing ranch operations, teaching the local children, or organizing community events. "Mama, look!" Emma called, pointing to a large wagon approaching from the direction of town. "Uncle Frank is coming." Barbara shaded her eyes against the winter sun, recognizing Frank Martinez's familiar figure driving what appeared to be a heavily loaded supply wagon. Behind him came several other wagons, suggesting this was more than a routine delivery of ranch supplies. Edward emerged from the barn where he had been working with the newest group of horses bound for cavalry units in California. The ranch had grown substantially over the past 5 years, and Edward now employed 15 full-time hands, and twice that number during busy seasons. More importantly, the Circle H had become the model for what Samuel had originally envisioned. A.E. Successful transition from mining wealth to sustainable agricultural enterprise. "Expecting supplies today?" Barbara asked as Edward approached the porch. "Not supplies," Edward replied, his eyes bright with excitement. "Something better. Remember that letter I received from the territorial government last month?" Barbara did. Remember, Edward had been corresponding with officials in Carson City about a pilot program to help miners transition to farming and ranching as the silver deposits played out. The Circle H had been selected as a demonstration site, and Edward had been appointed as a consultant to help develop training programs for men who wanted to learn agricultural skills. "The first group of trainees?" Barbara asked, understanding. "Dawn, 12 men from various mining operations around the territory. They'll be here for 3 months, learning everything from animal husbandry to crop rotation. The territorial government is providing funding for their training and supporting them while they establish their own operations." As the wagons drew closer, Barbara could see the men Edward was talking about, a diverse group that included experienced miners, recent immigrants, and even a few former soldiers looking for new opportunities in civilian life. They looked tired from the journey, but hopeful, much the way Barbara imagined she must have looked when she first arrived in Millbrook. Frank Martinez pulled his wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down with a broad grin. "Brought you some new neighbors, boss, and they're all eager to learn from the famous Barbara Harrison." Barbara felt a familiar flutter of surprise at being called by her married name, even after 5 years. It still sometimes seemed impossible that she had transformed from a desperate mail-order bride into someone whose opinions were sought by territorial officials and whose methods were being studied for replication throughout Nevada. "Famous might be overstating things," Barbara said modestly. "Not according to the Carson City newspaper," Frank replied, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Article right here about how the Circle H training program is revolutionizing agricultural development in mining territories." Edward took the newspaper and read aloud. "Mrs. Barbara Harrison's innovative approach to practical education combines traditional academic instruction with hands-on agricultural training, creating a model that other territories are already seeking to replicate. Her curriculum includes not just farming techniques, but also business management, correspondence skills, and community organization, all essential elements for successful transition to agricultural life." Barbara felt a warm glow of pride, tempered by the practical awareness that such recognition brought increased responsibilities. Over the past 2 years, she had developed a comprehensive training program that had already helped 37 former miners establish successful farms and ranches throughout northern Nevada. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, allowing her to use all of her skills while contributing to something larger than herself. Mrs. Harrison, one of the men from the wagons, approached hesitantly. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. I've been mining silver for 8 years, but the veins are playing out. I heard you can teach a man to make a living from the land instead." Barbara studied Thomas Mitchell's earnest face, seeing in it the same desperate hope she had once felt. "I can teach you what you need to know, Mr. Mitchell, but learning requires commitment. Agricultural success doesn't come overnight. I'm ready to work, ma'am. We all are. As Edward and Frank began organizing the newcomers and showing them to the bunkhouse that had been constructed specifically for training participants, Barbara found herself reflecting on the remarkable turn her life had taken. The woman who had once been terrified of her own limited options was now helping others expand their possibilities. That evening, after the trainees had been settled and fed, Barbara sat in the ranch house kitchen working on her correspondence. She maintained regular contact with agricultural departments in 3 territories, sharing successful techniques and learning about innovations being developed elsewhere. She also corresponded with several women's colleges back east, describing the opportunities available for educated women on the frontier. Edward found her there, as he often did, working by lamplight after their children were asleep. "Writing to Professor Davidson again?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Professor Davidson was the head of the Agricultural Studies program at Cornell University, who had been following Barbara's work with great interest. "He's asking for detailed curriculum materials. Apparently, Cornell is considering adding a program specifically designed to train women for agricultural management roles." "And what are you telling him?" Barbara set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "I'm telling him that women are particularly well suited for the organizational and educational aspects of agricultural development. We're natural teachers, efficient managers, and we tend to think systematically about resource allocation." Edward smiled. "Careful, or you'll find yourself invited to lecture at universities back east." "Actually," Barbara said, "Professor Davidson has extended exactly such an invitation. Cornell would like me to spend a month next spring teaching. They're advanced agricultural students about frontier farming methods." Edward's expression grew serious. "And what do you think about that?" Barbara had been considering the invitation for weeks, weighing the honor of such recognition against the practical realities of her life. "I think it's an incredible opportunity to influence the next generation of agricultural development. But I also think my real work is here, with people like Thomas Mitchell who need practical help rather than theoretical instruction." "It doesn't have to be an either-or choice," Edward pointed out. "You could do both. Share your knowledge with university students, then return to continue the work here. Would you mind managing everything here for a month while I'm gone?" Edward reached over and took her hand. "Barbara, 5 years ago, you asked me to promise that I would never try to limit your opportunities. I meant that promise then, and I mean it now. If teaching at Cornell is something you want to do, then you should do it." The conversation was interrupted by a soft cry from upstairs, baby Samuel waking for his evening feeding. As Barbara rose to tend to him, Edward caught her hand. "Have I ever told you how proud I am of what you've accomplished?" he asked quietly. Barbara felt the familiar warmth that Edward's approval always brought her. "You tell me regularly, though. I'm not sure I deserve such praise. I'm just using the skills I've always had." "You're using skills. You've always had to build something entirely new. There's a difference." Edward paused, then continued more softly. "Samuel would have been amazed to see what you've become." It was a rare reference to the man whose death had brought them together, and Barbara appreciated Edward's acknowledgement of the strange path that had led to their happiness. "I think about him sometimes," she admitted, "about the life we might have built together. It would have been completely different from this. Better or worse?" Barbara considered the question. "Seriously, different. Samuel was a dreamer, full of grand visions and optimistic plans. Life with him would have been exciting, probably chaotic, definitely unpredictable. And with me, with you, life is solid, built on respect and partnership and genuine care for each other's welfare. We've created something sustainable, something that can weather difficulties and grow stronger over time. As baby Samuel's cries grew more insistent, Barbara headed upstairs, but not before kissing Edward's forehead. "I love you, Edward Harrison. Not because you were the only option available to me, but because you're exactly the partner I needed, even when I didn't know what I needed." Later that night, after the household had settled into silence, Barbara stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the ranch that had become her world. The training program participants were settled in their quarters, probably discussing among themselves the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching them the same lessons she had learned over the past 5 years. That success on the frontier required not just hard work, but adaptability, community cooperation, and the willingness to constantly learn and grow. In the distance, she could see the lights of Millbrook, which had grown from a rough mining town into a thriving community of nearly 800 residents. The town now boasted a proper school where Miss Wells still taught, though she now had 2 assistant teachers to help manage the increased enrollment. Dr. Thompson's Cultural Society had become a regular feature of community life, organizing monthly lectures and seasonal performances that drew audiences from surrounding towns. Barbara's own contributions to the community extended far beyond the ranch training program. She served on the school board, organized an annual harvest festival that had become a regional celebration, and had established a lending library that served rural families throughout the county. She had also helped found a women's cooperative that marketed agricultural products from small farms, providing crucial income for families throughout the territory. The work was demanding and never-ending, but it was exactly the kind of meaningful engagement Barbara had always craved. She had found her purpose not in the refined Eastern life she had once known, nor in the conventional domestic role she had originally expected to fill, but in something entirely new, a frontier woman's version of intellectual and practical leadership. As she prepared for bed, Barbara's thoughts turned to the letter she had received that morning from her distant cousin in Boston, describing the limited opportunities available to unmarried women in eastern cities. The contrast with her own situation was striking. In Nevada territory, Barbara's gender was far less important than her competence. She was judged by her results rather than her adherence to social conventions, respected for her knowledge rather than her conformity to expectations. "Are you thinking profound thoughts again?" Edward asked from the bed, where he was reading the latest issue of Agricultural Weekly. "Just reflecting on how strange life is," Barbara replied, settling beside him. 5 years ago, I thought my options were limited to marrying a stranger or facing poverty and social disgrace. Now I'm training men to become farmers, corresponding with university professors, and considering teaching at Cornell. And are you happy with how things turned out? Barbara considered the question, looking around the bedroom they had shared for 4 years. It was a comfortable, practical space that reflected their partnership in every detail. Edward's books on horse breeding shared shelf space with her agricultural journals. Her desk occupied one corner while his occupied another, and the room's large windows provided the good light they both needed for their evening work. "I'm more than happy," Barbara said finally. "I'm fulfilled in ways I never imagined possible. I have meaningful work, a true partnership with someone I love and respect, children who are growing up to be confident and capable, and a community where I can make a real difference. No regrets about the path not taken, the comfortable Eastern life you might have had?" Barbara shook her head decisively. "No regrets at all. I came west looking for security and found purpose instead. I came as a mail-order bride and discovered I was actually a pioneer." Edward set aside his magazine and pulled Barbara closer. "Do you ever wonder what advice you'd give to that frightened young woman who stepped off the train in Millbrook 5 years ago?" Barbara thought about this seriously. I'd tell her that her greatest strength isn't her education or her refinement, but her willingness to adapt and grow. I'd tell her that the future she's imagining, safe, predictable, conventional, would never have satisfied her the way she thinks it will. And what else? I'd tell her that sometimes the most devastating setbacks lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. That losing the future you planned can open the door to a future you never dared to imagine. As they settled into sleep, Barbara felt the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. She had begun as a woman whose choices seemed limited by circumstances beyond her control. She was ending as someone who had created her own possibilities, who had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others in her community. Outside their window, snow began to fall gently over the Nevada landscape, covering the ranch buildings and the fields where next year's crops would grow. It was the same kind of snow that had been falling the night Barbara first arrived in Millbrook, but everything else had changed completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, training, sessions to conduct, correspondence to answer, problems to solve, and opportunities to pursue. Barbara looked forward to all of it with the confidence of a woman who had learned that her capabilities were far greater than she had ever suspected, and that the future was something to be built rather than simply endured. In the quiet darkness of the ranch house, surrounded by the family she had created and the community she had helped to build, Barbara Harrison fell asleep with a smile on her face, grateful beyond measure for the train that had brought her west to a funeral and led her instead to the life of her dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.